My name is Make, and shortly after graduating from college, I was living in a small studio in Chicago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single room on the top floor of a 3-story building. I chose this place because the rent was affordable and it was close to my job. I was a 23-year-old buried in student debt and without savings. I didn't have many options to be picky. The apartment was simple, functional, and most importantly, it was mine. The only window faced a narrow alley. On the other side of the alley was an apartment building almost identical to mine. The alley was so narrow that barely a car could fit, and during the day, very little sunlight reached it. At night, the place was completely dark with no natural light at all. That had never been a problem for me. I worked late as a bartender in a lounge on the north side of the city. I usually got home around 2:30 or 3 a.m., made something quick to eat, and spent some time on my phone until I fell asleep. But one night, about a month after moving in, I noticed something strange. I had just gotten home, lazily took off my shoes, and turned on the ceiling light when something caught my attention. A quick movement in the window across the alley. It was almost imperceptible. Maybe just a slight shake of the curtain. I froze for a few seconds, my heart racing. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe it was just a gust of wind. The next night, the same thing happened. As soon as I turned on the lights, that apartment's curtain moved again. This time, there was no doubt in my mind. I clearly saw a hand pulling the curtain aside before letting it return to its original position. But what really unsettled me was realizing that I had never seen any light on in that place before. I had always assumed it was empty, uninhabited. That night, I spent hours tossing in bed, the image of that hand stuck in my head. The following week, I started paying more attention. Every night, without fail, as soon as I turned on my light, the curtain moved. It was subtle, almost too discreet, but impossible to ignore. Always the same scene. The curtain slowly opening. I would catch a glimpse of the dark space behind it, and then it would snap shut. I decided to test it. Some nights, I left my apartment in darkness and sat quietly by the window. In those moments, nothing happened. Over time, I became obsessed. It wasn't just the curtain moving, it was the feeling of being watched. Chilled ran down my spine, as if something invisible were there in the building across the alley. The idea that it could be a resident seemed unlikely after all. There was no sign of life in that apartment. No sound, no light, just that movement. Always the same. I started becoming paranoid, staring at that window every day. Could someone be trapped in there? Could it be some kind of signal? Questions with no answers that only increased my discomfort. Until one night, I decided to stay awake, waiting to see if anything more happened. The curtain moved the moment I turned on the light, but this Jimmy, something was different. A shadow seemed to be behind the window, as dark as the night, but with a defined shape, motionless, staring directly at me. The air turned icy. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if that shadow was trying to tell me something, or just testing if I was paying attention. Then I heard a faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from the alley. My hole. Body tensed, and I realized I was alone, completely alone, yet I still felt a palpable presence. The curtain snapped shut abruptly, and the window went completely dark again. Since that night, my routine changed. I could no longer ignore that apartment, nor the mystery of that hand and that shadow. It was as if the entire building was hiding a secret I was meant to uncover, even if it cost me my sanity. But every time I turned on the lights, even if the glow was weak and only illuminated my sofa, I saw the curtain across the alley move. It was clear to me someone was watching me. I tried to find a logical explanation for it. Maybe someone liked to stare out the window at night, but that didn't make sense, especially since the movement always happened exactly when I got home. It was a very strange coincidence, almost impossible to ignore. I decided to ask my landlord about the apartment across the alley. He assured me it had been vacant for months. I pressed him, wanting to know if there was any chance someone had moved in recently, but he just shook his head with a suspicious smile. He even joked that I was getting paranoid. Then, one early morning, things got even more disturbing. I got home much later than usual, around 4 a.m. The bar I worked at had hosted a private event, and cleaning took much longer than I expected. I was exhausted, my mind too slow and tired to think clearly. When I inserted my key into the door, something caught my eye on the frame. At first, thought it was just some trash or a flyer. But When I picked up the crumpled paper, I saw it was a note, handwritten, simple. It said only one word. Hey. I stood there for a long time, that single word hammering in my head. Who would have left that note? And why? The silence of the night felt even heavier, as if the air were charged with something I couldn't understand, something that was only just beginning. In desperation, I grabbed my phone and called my friend Jamie, barely able to control my voice. She lived across the city, but without hesitation, she told me to come over immediately. I threw some essentials in my backpack, didn't stop to think too much, and rushed out of the apartment. The next day I decided to confront the situation head on and went to speak with the building owner once more. This time, I was firm and demanded he let me into the apartment across the alley so I could see for myself what was going on. He looked visibly uncomfortable and hesitant, but eventually agreed to meet me there and handed me the key. When we entered, the scene was desolate. The apartment was covered in dust and completely empty, not a single piece of furniture. The walls were bare and worn, and the wooden floor creaked with every step we took, giving the impression that the place was at least a century old. However, at the far end of the room, directly facing my window, there was a single metal folding chair. It was positioned as if someone had spent hours sitting there, staring straight at my window. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone had indeed access to that space, which should have been locked and abandoned. Without delay, I called the police, who arrived quickly to search the entire apartment. I'm sure they collected fingerprints and went through all the usual procedures, but in the end, nothing concrete came from it. The most disturbing part was the confirmation that my intuition had Dante deceived me. I really had been watched. Thinking that stranger, a sick person, could observe me for so long without my knowledge left me deeply unsettled. A feeling that seemed to eat me from the inside. I had no choice but to pack up and move out that same week, because living under that constant, invisible threat was simply unbearable. To this day, I have no idea who was really spying on me, how they got into that empty apartment, or how long it might have continued if I hadn't found that crumpled note with a simple "hey" written on it. Ooh, even considered the possibility that it might have been the landlord himself, but I ultimately dismissed that idea. And occasionally, I wake up in the middle of the night with the unsettling feeling that somewhere, someone is still watching me, as if that surveillance never really ended. This feeling reminds me of when I was 12. Before all this, back then, my family moved to a rural area of Oregon, dozens of miles from the nearest town. We lived on a large plot of land surrounded by a dense pine forest, a true haven of peace and isolation. The house we lived in was built in the 1940s and carried all the atmosphere typical of an old construction, creaking floors with every step, a dark and unsettling attic, and a worn shed about 30 feet from the back door. This shed was filled with old tools and a pile of scrap left by the previous owner. My father always talked about cleaning the place, but for some reason, he never found the time. Most of the time, we avoided the shed and the area around it, but I clearly remember the first time something really strange caught my attention. It was an ordinary weeknight, close to midnight, and I was lying in bed reading a book by the light of a flashlight hidden under the covers. Suddenly, I heard a dog, Max, barking like never before, with that urgency he had only when he sensed something was wrong. Max was a lovable and very gentle golden retriever, but also extremely aware of his. When he started barking like that, it wasn't something to ignore. Slowly getting up, I went to the window. He was standing in the yard, staring intently at the shed, barking frantically into the darkness. The motion sensor light near the back door was on, casting long, threatening shadows over the damp lawn. I couldn't see anything, no figure. No movement beyond the branches swaying in the wind, but Max wouldn't stop. I stood there for a few minutes just watching until he finally calmed down. Then I went back for a while. The house returned to an almost normal silence. But about a month after that incident, Max disappeared. We searched desperately for him, scoured the dense forest, checked the road up and down, and even asked the neighbors. But there was no sign of our loyal companion. He had simply vanished without a trace. I was completely devastated. My heart was in pieces. I clung to the faint hope that Max had just gotten lost in the forest, maybe scared, and would come home any moment. Around 3 a.m., a sound pierced the silence, the creak of the back door slowly opening. I got up quietly and tiptoed down the hallway, trying not to make a sound. My father was already there, gripping the rifle tightly, Eyes wide and alert, we stepped out into the yard just in time to see the motion sensor light turn on. And there he was, standing by the shed, as menacing as the last time. But now, he was holding something in his hands. In one hand, a knife gleamed cold and sharp under the light. In the other, he held Max's collar with the dog's skin still attached. When I realized what he had in his hands, it felt as if my body had been emptied, as if all my strength was sucked out. A horrible feeling of weightlessness took over, almost making me collapse. My father shouted and raised the rifle to shoot, but the man turned quickly and vanished into the darkness of the forest. We immediately called the police, who scoured the area thoroughly, but found no trace of the intruder. What shocked us even more was what they discovered inside the shed. The floor, previously covered in dust and old tools, had been carefully cleaned. In the exposed dirt, someone had carved strange, macabre drawings filled with a disturbing energy that made me feel nauseous just looking at them. That shed had become an altar for some kind of dark ritual. In the dusty corner of the shed, the officers found a pile of bones. Thankfully, they were animal bones, I thought. But it didn't make the scene any less disturbing. In fact, it made it worse. The sense of horror only increased when they discovered, hidden behind a false panel on the wall, a backpack. It wasn't ours. It was filled with strange objects. Torn wallets, old watches, and some worn clothing, likely belonging to several different people. But what truly made my hair stand on end was an old, worn nochibuki full of handwritten pages. The content was chaos, bizarre symbols, disconnected scribbles, irregular handwriting, and crude drawings, representing houses, families, and watchful eyes. It seemed like some kind of message, a sinister warning that this man was watching us as he had watched other families before us. The police collected everything they found for investigation. That night, while packing our bags to leave that cursed house, I cast one last glance at the shed through the window. The police tape still fluttered in the faint breeze, and silence dominated the yard. But then, just beyond the shed, maybe 3 meters, toward the trees, I caught sight of a human face. For a frozen moment in time, his eyes met mine. But the moment I blinked, the figure vanished like smoke. A wave of panic overwhelmed me, and I screamed my father's name in desperation. He's back. My father ran to the living room and looked out the window, confused, asking where I had seen it. I pointed firmly at the shed, but he wasn't there. He was at the edge of the forest, to the left of the shed, among the dark trees. Without hesitation, my father grabbed the rifle and ran like a madman into the yard, shouting and firing shots around, trying to scare away that invisible threat. I will never forget the mix of anger and helplessness I felt in that moment, being forced to abandon your own home because a sick, cruel, dangerous person decided to turn our lives into a nightmare. And to make matters worse, that same person had probably taken the life of my best friend. In that instant, my father was unleashing all his accumulated frustration and anger. I knew deep down he wanted to end that threat once and for all. A few days later, we left that remote area of Oregon behind and moved to a much more urban location, where the sense of isolation was less and danger seemed a little farther away. In the summer of 2018, more settled, my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains. With me were Abby, Marcus, his younger brother Tim, his girlfriend Hannah, and myself. We were all in our early 20s, freshly graduated, eager for a break from the noise of daily life and the worries of the modern world. We chose a remote spot within the national park where the trees were tall and dense. The air heavy with the fresh scent of pine and the moisture of wet earth. There was no cell signal, nothing. 04 miles. It was exactly what we needed to disconnect completely. The first night, everything seemed normal. We arrived, set up our camp in a clearing near a serene lake with enough space for the 3 tents we brought. We lit a fire and prepared hot dogs over the flames, along with golden marshmallows. We sat together, sharing stories and laughter, drinking a little, and getting lost in the vast, starry sky. The absolute silence of the forest was comforting, almost therapeutic. But it was only on the second night that something began to feel wrong. Around 11 p.m., while still gathered around the fire, laughing and swapping stories, Marcus suddenly froze. His body stiffened, and his eyes fixed on a dark point beyond the flames. He pointed with a trembling finger into the forest and asked in a low, tense voice if we had seen it too. Everyone agreed to call it a night. We put out the fire, closed the tents, and tried to sleep. That night I woke to something that still haunts me. Breathing outside, probably not even 10 feet from my head. At first, I thought I was in some half-dream state. But it continued. I wasn't alone. I had 4 other people with me. It could have been one of them going to pee, but I didn't hear the sound of a stream, just the breathing. The breathing also almost sounded like an older person, someone short of breath from smoking too much. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't dare turn it on. The breathing moved from one side of the tent to the other. Then it stopped. I waited silently because it was the only thing I could do. As the breathing stopped abruptly, I felt a sense of relief, thinking it must have been one of my friends outside. But when we met for breakfast, Marcus had a worried look on his face, as if he was eager to tell us something. He said someone had been outside our tent last night. Hannah nodded and said she had also heard it, and noticed that whoever it was had walked around the tent more than once and could have been more than one person. I asked the whole group if anyone had gotten up to pee last night. Maybe that was what we heard. Tim said he had, but he thought he saw a figure crouched near the fire. Around 4 a.m. we scoured the area and found footprints circling the 3 tents. But in a spot where the dirt was a bit wetter, Mari like mad, one of the footprints was clearly a bare human foot, not shoes or boots. Hannah suggested we pack up and leave, but Marcus and I thought it was a terrible idea. Dismantling the camp so late and finding our way back in the dark would not only be difficult but terrifying, especially if that man was following us. That was the worst night I've ever experienced. I couldn't sleep a single minute. Perhaps that vigilance saved me, or at least my belongings. Many hours passed until I heard the distant sound of a branch breaking or a leaf being stepped on. I whispered, "Hopefully it's a deer." Silence fell until a voice came from the forest. "I see you." It wasn't any of my friends, and no one responded. I think we were all paralyzed with fear. The unexpected happened. I heard my tent move. I got up and saw the zipper slowly starting to descend. I screamed as loud as I could, and so did my friends. Whoever was outside ran off, at least, I assume. Our only option was to shout to each other to communicate between the tents. I closed the zipper and heard nothing more that night. I couldn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to rise. In the morning, we packed up and left, but the tension didn't leave us. At the ranger station, we told everything. They said there had already been reports of 1 or more men living there, saw me stealing, others doing worse. We didn't even want to know. We laughed in the car, but nothing seemed funny to me. After that night, camping was never the same, especially after what happened with the zipper. So, have you ever imagined being in the middle of nowhere with no signal and someone or something watching you in the dark? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more tailies that'll mess with your mind, but always with that cozy before bed vibe. And of course, if you've experienced something strange like this, or a story no one believes, send it to Usen. Who knows? Your experience might appear in the next video. Until then, and watch out for the tent zipper. You never know who might be on the other side.